So we're looking this morning at what's called Second Isaiah. That is to say, Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. But first, to set the scene, we look at the opening chapter of the book of Ezra. And it goes like this. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, and he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, saying, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem in Judah. Any of these among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah to build the house of the Lord, and let all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold." And also provides for taking back vessels. Now, the question is, how much of this is true? There's certainly some exaggeration in it. What we do know, in 539, Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon. He did issue a decree which has survived on a cylinder. Now, these inscriptions are often put in foundations, and this one is called the Cyrus Cylinder, and it contains a decree allowing certain people to return to their homeland and to take their gods back with them. Now, gods, meaning statues, were often taken captive with the people. So there certainly was some edict of restoration by Cyrus. The Cyrus Cylinder does not mention Judah. Judah is a bit farther away and perhaps a bit less important than the ones that are mentioned. It is not, I think, particularly implausible that he did permit a return, because obviously there was a return at some point. Now, but there were several returns, actually, and when we get to the book of Ezra proper, we'll find people were still coming back in the middle of the following century. But there does seem to have been some return, and we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks when we get to Haggai and Zechariah and the rebuilding of the temple. Now, what the book of Ezra here wants you to believe is that as Cyrus issued this decree, and we know that in the case of Babylon, Cyrus said, "It is Marduk, the god of Babylon, who raised me up because of the abuses of your former king Nabonidus. And therefore you should welcome me, Cyrus, with open arms. I'm really a pious Babylonian." Now, it is not impossible that he said the same thing to the Judeans, except that it is Yahweh, your God, or what they will typically call him in these texts, the God of heaven, who raised you up, who raised me up. So it's not implausible, I think, that he did, or it may be that they're doing this by extension, but he certainly did allow them to rebuild the temple. Now, for the moment, though, I'm interested in setting the scene for what we call Second Isaiah, because the prophet that we call Second Isaiah certainly took this at face value. I mean, not that he knew what we have in the book of Ezra, but he certainly regarded Cyrus as somebody who was raised up by God. Cyrus, has been cited in political discourse in this country recently. Some evangelicals making an analogy with President Trump of, a pagan who was raised up to do the work of God. We leave that one aside. But Cyrus certainly, nobody is saying that he worshipped the God of Israel, but it was the Persian propaganda to speak of the God of heaven, which was a way of referring to Ahura Mazda, the Persian god. But a God of heaven could also extend to apply to Yahweh. So the prophet of 2nd Isaiah takes it very much at face value that God has raised up this king, Cyrus, and these are probably the most enthusiastic, upbeat oracles that you get anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Many of them familiar to you perhaps from Handel's Messiah. Comfort ye, my people. This is the first prophet we have met who is trying to comfort anybody. Most of the prophets are trying to make people uncomfortable. But when you hit rock bottom, there's only one way to go, and that is back up. So this is the refrain with which the oracles of 2nd Isaiah start. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. And cry to her, for she has served her term. Her penalty is paid. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Now, you see, in the prophets that we have addressed, it has been a consistent theme that what happened to Israel and Judah was punishment, and that they deserved it. Now you have a prophet saying, you have received double punishment. Now that's an interesting idea, because it suggests that the punishment wasn't quite fair, or perhaps that it served some other purpose. And we'll come to this shortly when we get to Isaiah 53. And this is one of the really important ideas in these chapters, the idea that suffering could possibly serve a purpose other than punishment. And this, I think, is a very important idea in the whole development of religion. A voice cries out. Notice it is not the voice of one crying in the wilderness. It will become that in the New Testament. Creative mistranslation is responsible for a lot of theology. The exhibit A of that is in the book of Exodus, where God says to Moses, I am who I am. And this became, in Greek, I am the one who is, and became the foundation stone on which Western metaphysics was built. The idea that God equals being with a capital B. And originally, this no doubt was a mistranslation. But in this case here, now again, this would be adapted, let us say, in the New Testament. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert the highway for your God. Why in the wilderness? Well, you see, there are two aspects to it. On the one hand, what he is promising is a new Exodus. This is going to be a replay of the Exodus, starting over. But also, in order to get back to Judah from Babylon, you got to cross the wilderness. There is a huge desert area in between there. So this, fits nicely. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill brought low, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And in verse 6, a voice says that when you have a voice crying out like this is, one of the spirits or angels in the heavenly council. A voice says, cry out. What shall I say? All people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. If all people are grass, is that good news or bad news? Well, it depends, you see, which people you're talking about. And I think the element of good news in this is that it's saying the power of the Babylonians fades. So, if you are a small, oppressed people, it's good news that all power fades. But on the other hand, there is another side to it, because you're as much grass as anybody else. And this is not a particularly comforting thought. But it's quite in line. You see, these chapters were just added on to the oracles of Isaiah of Jerusalem. And they were added on, I think, for a reason that a lot of them deal with Zion, Jerusalem, and there are motifs that carry through the whole book. And one of them is, that God is holy and people are basically not much. It's a rather stark, the grandeur of God and the insignificance of humanity. It is a theme throughout the book of Isaiah. Now, the point here really isn't to emphasize the insignificance, though. It's to emphasize that the power of the oppressor is being broken. If you skip to chapter 43, it should be verse 16. Thus says the Lord, yes, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. When did he do that? Exodus, yeah. So this is again the new Exodus theme. Who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise. They're extinguished, quenched like a wick. Now that seems to be recalling the Exodus. But then he says, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Does he want you to remember the Exodus or not? Why would he? Yeah. Yeah. So it's recalling the past, but not as past. It's and it's a view of history. I mean, back when I was in graduate school, it was very fashionable to say that in the Bible you have a linear view of history, and in the ancient Near East you have a cyclical view. But it's not true most of the time, because this is quite cyclical in a way. The idea is there are patterns that repeat themselves. Now, there are linear elements in the Bible, maybe more than you get documented in the ancient Near East, but there is also a lot of this idea of the primordial myth that gets replayed over and over again. The best example of that in these chapters is in chapter 51, 9 to 11. Awake, awake. Put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces? You all remember that story, right? Where is it? Where do you get it? Well, of course, you don't get it. You just get allusions to it. There's an allusion to it also in the book of Job. But you know the type of the story. It's like Marduk and Tiamat, like Baal and Yam. It's the idea that God, in the process of creation, God slew a dragon who pierced the dragon. Was it not you who dried up the sea? Now, you see what he's doing here is he is collapsing three moments in history. That there is, when did God slay the dragon? Well, you may say it was in creation, but I think this prophet would say, but also in the Exodus, that was also slaying the dragon. And most importantly, he's slaying the dragon again now. Dragons have a way of coming back to life. They're never fully dead. They're just suppressed for a while. And so here, then who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over, so the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. So this is the pattern that he discerns in history. Now, he also says in, I think it's chapter 45, do I have the reference here for it? Yes, in 45:15, you are a God who hides yourself. Now, the point is God has hidden himself in the conquest of Jerusalem and the exile, so that people would look at this and say, their God has no power. Now, if you believe in revelation in history, you have to pick your moments. Because, from the viewpoint of 2nd Isaiah, the decree of Cyrus, that's God acting in history. That tells you what's really going on in history. But you could have looked at it and said the destruction of Jerusalem tells you what's going on in history, and that Marduk controls it all. So you have to be selective in the points that you pick as revelatory. But the way he explains this is that God hides himself, that you have a hidden God. And that, of course, is an admission that a lot of the time what happens in history doesn't tell you what's really going on. So what this prophet is trying to say is that it's the restoration that counts more than the exile and the original defeat. Also in chapter 45, in the passage that tends to get cited nowadays, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Now, his anointed, the Hebrew word is Mashiach, often translated Messiah. It's the anointed agent of God is Cyrus. Now, there are several ramifications to that. This prophet is not expecting a restoration of monarchy in Judea. Cyrus will be their king. That is just political realism. It wasn't going to happen under the Persians. We will find when we get to Zechariah that some people hoped for it anyway. But this prophet recognizes we're not going there. It's Cyrus who is the king. But then there is also the idea that God can raise up a pagan king to do his bidding. That's not really such a novel idea. Earlier in the book of Isaiah, in 1st Isaiah, you had the idea that Assyria was the rod of Yahweh's anger, that God was using Assyria to punish Israel. Well, here he is supposedly using Cyrus to restore Judah. Any question about any of this so far? Now, I might add in passages I'm not going to look at here. 2nd Isaiah expects, a spectacular reversal. That when Judah is restored, then it will rise and all the other nations will become subject to it. Now, that's a flight of prophetic imagination. It wasn't about to happen, but this is the moment of enthusiasm, when they're starting over and all things seem possible. Now, what this prophet is probably most famous for is a number of poems that are known as servant songs. Now, these were singled out. I think I mentioned to you before a great German scholar named Bernhard Doom. It's kind of appropriately named for working on the prophets. So people would refer to prophets of doom. But he is also the one who argued for the division of the book of Isaiah. And somebody made the quip that Isaiah was sawn asunder again. But you see, in the case of 2nd Isaiah, there is absolutely no doubt as to the period of time it's referring to. It actually mentions Cyrus by name. This is unusual enough. Nebuchadnezzar and Shalmaneser get mentioned by name, but it's not that common in the prophets. And so it's clearly talking about the Persian period, which was a couple of 100 years after the career of the original Isaiah. Now, this is, I suppose, a premise of historical criticism, that we read these texts on the assumption that they were meant to make sense to the people to whom they were spoken, first of all, whatever further sense you may later find in them. Now, the servant songs are a prime example of that, because these also are texts that were very much picked up and used as prophecies by early Christianity. In all truth, they probably should never have been singled out. 2nd Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, is a collection of short songs, short poems. Unlike some of the other prophets, it does not seem to have been heavily edited. You do not get layers of Deuteronomistic editing that kind of cuts against the original prophet. These seem to have been pretty well preserved. And these songs are just songs or poems in the general mix. They are part of this little collection of poems. But we will look at them here in sequence anyway. The first one is in chapter 42, verses 1 to 6. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice on the earth. And a little bit further down, I am the Lord, I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. Now, I don't think the servant is always the same person in these poems. There may be some variation. In this one, it's quite ambiguous. There are a couple of leading candidates. One of them is Cyrus. Cyrus is actually the person who would release captives, who might arguably be said to bring justice to the nations. It's a bit of a stretch to say the bruised reed he will not crush. He was a military conqueror after all. He wasn't all that gentle. But it's a possibility in this case. The other leading possibility in this case, I think, is probably the prophet, the anonymous prophet who wrote these oracles. Now, and how would he bring forth justice to the nations? Well, by preaching about it. Perhaps. Now, the third possibility, which will be stronger, I think, in one of the other poems, is that the servant is Israel. And we will see really the basis for that in the next one, which is in chapter 49. Now, could you say that Israel brings forth justice to the nations? Well, possibly. If you imagine a situation where Israel becomes the center of a new world order, however implausible that may be, of being a light to the nations actually makes a fair bit of sense. It's the idea that Israel would be held up as a light, an example to the other nations. But from 42, I'd leave all those options open. If you turn to 49, 49, 1 to 6. Listen to me, O coastlands. The Lord called me before I was born. Who else had been called before he was born? Jeremiah. So there's certainly a prophetic character at play here. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Now, if you accept that text as written, that settles the identity of the servant. The servant is Israel. Now, if you want to argue that it's somebody other than Israel, you have to amend this text. And I think, it's all right to amend the text. There are lots of mistakes in the Hebrew Bible that were, happened in the course of copying it and transmitting it, but you need to have a reason to do it. And I don't think there is a good reason to amend the text in this case. Now, if so, it is Israel imagined as being like a prophet of the type of Jeremiah. And there will be a few other touches of that. And now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. Now, that verse has occasioned a lot of debate, because people ask, if the servant is Israel, how can its purpose be to bring Israel back to him? And I think, that there are two ways of looking at that. One is to say that the reason Israel is raised up is to bring Israel back to him, so that Israel may return to him. But there is also, I think, a possibility that there's a distinction here, which we will find repeatedly from this point onward in the course, between, so to speak, the true Israel and ordinary Israel. That there is a distinction being made within Israel. That the Israel who is the servant is the ideal Israel who is to transform the rest of the people. Perhaps. Going on with 49, it is too late that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. So you see, the way I would read that is to say it's too late a thing that Israel be restored. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Now there, I think you have an idea that's very important for 2nd Isaiah, and that is that the suffering of Israel or Judah in the exile has a purpose that goes beyond Israel or Judah itself. It is a purpose that has to do with giving a message to the other nations. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The third so-called servant song in chapter 50 is different from the others. It does not refer to the figure in question as a servant. And in this case, I think it may well be the prophet himself. The Lord has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning, he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. See his appreciation for the fact that people may be a little bit sleepy in the morning. The Lord has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I gave my back to those who struck me, my cheeks to those who pulled my beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. It is the Lord God who helps me. Now that, again, is kind of like Jeremiah, but it doesn't use the language of servant. It doesn't have the motif of light to the nations. And I would take it that this one is just talking about the prophet himself. The big one, however, is the fourth servant song. And this is the one that would have huge ramifications in later tradition. It begins at the end of chapter 52 verse 13. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Now, this is a kind of introduction, third person, detached narrator, saying, people are in for a big surprise. Now, again, I'm reading this on the assumption that the servant in question is Israel in the exile. And the premise of it is that in the eyes of most people, Israel in the exile was as good as dead. That they had been practically wiped off the map and were unlikely ever to be restored. That was what most people would have figured. Now he says, they're in for a big surprise. The speaker changes then in chapter 53. Who has believed what we have heard? And at this point, the speaker are the kings of the nations, or the leaders of the nations. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised, rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity, one from whom others hid their faces. He was despised and held to be of no account. A refrain that runs through this poem is how he is held to be of no account. Nothing cuts deeper than the lack of respect. You know, it's the lack of honor, the shame and the lack of honor. Now, I mean, some people have argued that this is referring to a particular individual, and the candidates that they come up with are the king or the prophet. But in order to apply it to them, you have to suppose a history of which we have no other information. So I think it is much more satisfactory to accept what we were told in chapter 49, that the servant originally here is Israel. You will see a little bit later in it how this passage gets to be seen as messianic. But I think, you know, the people who had actually gone through this kind of suffering and who had suffered this loss of respect were the Jewish exiles in Babylon. Maybe not so much the whole people of Israel, but these people. It's the people who are deported to Babylon who are taken here as being the servant of the Lord. And then it says in verse 4, surely he has borne our infirmities, carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted, but he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. And we like sheep have gone astray, have turned to our own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now, what does it mean to say that one person bears the iniquity of another? Have we had anything like that? Or did you have anything like it last semester? Well, animal sacrifice, yes. I mean, you don't generally give the animal that sacrificed that much agency, if you know what I mean. There is a sense, you know, in which the victim bears the iniquity. But you don't think of the animal as somehow having any agency in atoning. David? Well, I mean, this is definitely a different take on things. I'd say, the dominant take on that question in the Hebrew Bible up to this point has been that people are punished for their sin and their children are punished for the parents' sin. Now, Ezekiel went in one direction and said, no, everybody is punished for their own sin. But here you have really a new possibility, I think, at least a new possibility as applied to a human agent, that a human can bear the sin of the people. Now, you have a couple of possible precedents for it. One of the more obvious ones, I think, is the scapegoat. Now, this, again, has the problem that the scapegoat doesn't have any agency. But you do have the language of placing the sin on the scapegoat. But I think it's worthwhile asking, how was the scapegoat supposed to have worked? And this, I think, would also be true of animals that were sacrificed. It's essentially the same dynamic. So, if an animal is sacrificed, or the scapegoat, you put your hands on the head of the scapegoat and say, shoo, does that actually relieve you of sin? This is an old theological question, often a dividing line between Catholics and Protestants, actually. Because, the Catholic line on this has often been ex opere operato, which means, objectively, the ritual does it. And then the alternative to that is ex opere operantis, that it depends on it having an effect on you. And if you take it the latter way, then it would mean that in order for it to have an effect on you, you've got to see it and take it to heart. As the philosopher Paul Ricoeur was famous for saying, the symbol gives rise to thought. I think it's fair to say that for most people, symbols do not give rise to thought. They give rise to emotions. But what he meant was it should give rise to thought. There is another case, though, that I think is relevant here, and it's the only one I know of that speaks of laying the sin on a human being. And that is in the book of Ezekiel. You remember the story of Ezekiel, how he had to lie on one side for 390 days and bear the sin, he was told. Now, in the case of Ezekiel, at least, it was not ex opere operato. It was not the idea that if you lie on one side for 390 days, then the people won't have to be punished. It is rather, you do this so that the people may realize that they are going to be punished. That it is a means of communicating with the people. And I think that example is probably more relevant here in the case of the servant. In this case, I think the question is, why did Israel, or at least the deportees from Jerusalem, have to go through this miserable experience where many people were killed, many people, died in exile, whatever? And the solution that's being proposed to it is that they were bearing the sin of other peoples. And the idea here, I think, is that when they are restored, the Babylonians and the other peoples will look at this and understand that they were the ones who should have been punished, and that this would lead to conversion. Now, needless to say, this is all a highly optimistic kind of theology. Nothing like it would actually follow. But I think this is the logic that is at work in it. He was oppressed and was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. And that language was also used of the prophet Jeremiah. But now, the real novelty of this passage is the idea that your suffering can be used for the benefit of other people. Any of you believe that? Okay, good. We have one residual Christian. Yeah, but this in a way is one of the ideas on which Christianity was built. A huge history of it. Sometimes abused, in truth, but still an awfully important idea, and probably a more constructive way of looking at suffering, than some of the alternatives. Gloria. Yeah. 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 Now, the proper theological term for this is theodicy. Yeah, okay. So, you can describe this with slightly different valences. And if you do it with a more skeptical valence, as you just did, yes, he's trying to think of a way to understand this whereby you can still believe that God had a good purpose in it. And it is, one of the ultimate questions in life. Why bad things happen to good people. Now, most of the prophets would have said, oh, they weren't good people. That's one way of dealing with it. But this prophet has said, well, okay, they deserved some of it, but what they got was way more than they accepted. See, we'll get this replayed on an individual level in the book of Job, without this solution, I might add. But this is the solution offered in 2nd Isaiah, and one that would be taken up in Christianity much more than in Judaism, I would say, down through the centuries. The idea that suffering and death can somehow atone. Now, I think in the context of 2nd Isaiah, the atonement depends on the people taking notice and changing, on it triggering a new realization on their part. And this, as I say, was optimistic. But, whatever you call it, this is one of the major functions of theology. This is one of the major challenges to theology, is to deal with that question. And I don't think, in all honesty, that any solution to it is fully satisfactory. At that point, we appeal to the notion of mystery. But here, he was oppressed by perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave among the wicked and his tomb among the rich. Now, the language there is of death, to be followed by resurrection. This, again, is a novelty in the biblical tradition at this point. The death in question, I think, is what the exiles experienced. That it was a state, a country that seemed to have been wiped off the map. Obviously, you could extend this and use it as an analogy for individuals, but I don't think they're doing that yet here. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. That implies some kind of resurrection. Now, we had the language of resurrection also in Ezekiel 37, and I think in the Jewish tradition, in the biblical tradition, this is where the notion of resurrection first appears. It's in the resurrection of the people rather than the resurrection of individuals. And what it's saying here is that Judah would now be restored and would have a life, have an afterlife, if you like. Out of his anguish he shall see light. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Because he poured himself out to death, was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for their transgressors. Now, I think here the implication is still that they have to notice this, they have to realize it, and they have to change. But it's still assuming that this will work and be effective. This was not read in ancient Judaism in the Second Temple period as the prophecy of an individual. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a figure who applies some of this language to himself. But even so, I don't think he's quite claiming to be a Messiah. So I think the idea of a suffering Messiah, of somebody who would redeem the world by suffering and death, that I think is new with Christianity. And it was a theory developed to explain what actually happened to Jesus. Now, some of it then finds its way back into Judaism later on. But I don't think, it doesn't become a major theme in Judaism, but you do get it. But I don't think you get it before the rise of Christianity. So, you see, it's a new way of looking at suffering over against the rest of the prophets. It's the idea that suffering isn't necessarily punishment. There may be something constructive to it. It functions constructively by being a light to the nations, by the example that you give. So, it entails a spirituality, if you like. And one, as I say, that would have enormous consequences then in the whole history of Western religion. Questions or comments? It's unfortunate we can't time this lecture a little better. It should really be in Holy Week. But hopefully you'll remember it at that point. Okay, so on Wednesday you have a session with the TAs. Discuss both the midterm exam and the term paper. And then hopefully I will see you a week from today.